Okay, so we're gonna look into how to create auto-sizing text views on Android. And we're gonna be doing this in 4 different ways. We're gonna be using the support library, and we're not gonna be using the support library. And in these both two cases, we're gonna use either through Java or we're gonna create them through XML. So there's gonna be 4 different ways of doing this. And that's why I have 2 emulators up here. One of them is going to be running API 19. So in this case, the auto-sizing text views that you see here are using the support library. And in this case, the emulator is running on API 27, which means that it is not using a support library. But as you can see, they both behave the same way. So let's look at those scenarios. And by the way, this code will be available on GitHub, so you do not have to type it. Now I mentioned that there will be 4 instances of doing this. One support library, one not using a support library. Um, and then the other 2 is the same instance, but we're going to do it in program, um, which would be these 2 cases down here. But we'll go over these later. So for right now, let's just focus on XML, and the XML part is down here, but the main of the code would be in our layouts. So in terms of program structure and an overview, we have one activity that basically does the main page that we have here, and we have 2 layouts. Okay, so we have 2 layouts, and this is how we're going to do it through XML. You notice that these are actually named the same. They're both called activity underscore main, and then the second one's the same. But there's a V26 at the end. If you don't have experience with this, that just means that the layout will only load if it is 26 or above. And I'm setting the layout in my activity, set content view. That's a pretty common API. You use that a lot to set the layout. And I'm going to look at what this layout has, and it has 2 versions, which is the 2 layouts that I have here. And over here you see that it does have the V26 as well. So this just depends on the API the user is running. So let's just start at not supporting not using the support libraries. If you're not going to be doing that, that means your phone or the project will only run on API 26 and above. So the auto-sizing text view will not work if it's below that. In this instance, as we saw, the program has an edit text at the top. This is the same for everywhere else. This is where you could type your text whatever you want. And you notice that there's 3 instances of them. That's because there's 3 text views down here as well. They typically end up doing the same thing. It just depends on what you're trying to get out of your auto-sizing text views. The most common one is just using a uniform, and uniform has a set of preset values. So minimum text size is 12, and the maximum is 112, and granularity is I think that should be 1 SB actually. But that's basically the size that will reduce and increase whenever it doesn't or does have enough space. So that's basically the amount that the size of the text changes. So this is the default. That's the thing. And there's more. There's another one. This one is the granularity. This is basically the part where you actually can, well, modify it a bit more. You can give it the maximum size and minimum text size. We didn't have that option, the last one. So if you want a bit more, I guess, customization, this is another way of doing it. And there is, oh yes, you could also change the step of it as well. So you could say instead of 1 SP, which is the default, you could say 2 SP instead. And then there's a third version, very similar. Instead, you will pass an array of the sizes. So in this case, I have an array declared in my string file. It doesn't seem to find it for some reason, but it's there. Auto size, text sizes, and I am declaring here, I'm passing it to this variable. and I'm telling it that the only acceptable sizes are the ones that are inside this array. So it's 10, 12, 20, 40, and 100, which means that the text will never have a size of 50 and 60 or 80, only 40, and then jumps to 100. Um, that is the agreement if you use the AutoSize preset sizes. So you'll have a bit more customization on that side as well. Okay, so that's the XML for not using a support library. Okay, that is version number 1. And then this is the way of doing it if you are using a support library. It's very similar. You know, I can switch back and forth, only minor things changes. The number of thing is that you need to notice is that in this case, it's going to be plus API 14. So you're going to get a little bit more breathing room here. It's not so much as the 26 that we had without support libraries, which I think is one version. The latest right now is 27. And in this case, API 24 is quite old, so you're going to be reaching a lot of users. So since we're going to be using support library, first and foremost, you do need to import a couple of libraries. Make sure these two are implemented. This used to be compile. I don't know, it's still there, but if you're using Android Studio 3.0, like I am, now you need to use this new thing called implementation. So if that's a bit confusing, like I don't know what this is, that's just the way it works on Android Studio 3.0 and above. Um, but anyway, these are the two libraries that you need to import. The version number, that's just, you know, the latest that you have. So make sure that number is the latest whenever you're watching this video. After you have imported those two libraries, you should be able to access the app combat TextViews, and that's what's different between the support and non-support libraries. So in this case, that you saw is that we're using a text view, and that's just the basic Java class that we have. But in this case, the app combat text view is a support library that extends text view, and that's where the previous class was. So app combat text view is just a support library that creates additional methods for allowing older version of Android to do more stuff, like AutoSizing, like we're doing here. Everything else stays the same. Another additional thing is that make sure you're not using Android, you're using app, right? This is the name tag that you're going to be using, and the name tag comes from here. This is something that you won't have if you're not using the support library. So you see that link comes up, and instead of Android, we're going to be concatenating app in there. But everything else is the same. Nothing else about it change. And the class name, make sure obviously is app combat text, as I mentioned. It's not the regular text view. It's app combat text view, and you do, I believe you need the full link, otherwise it will shadow you. It says, yeah, it's unexpected name tag, so it doesn't actually find the class, and it doesn't find the same, doesn't find those variables. So that's how you do it through XML. Those are the two ways, support, non-support libraries. In terms of declaring it and running it, quite simple. You're gonna set the layout, and as I showed, the two come up. One is version 26, one is not. And I have a variable up here that says either we're gonna be initializing through XML, and since right now it's true, it means that this part of the code actually gets called. We will initialize through XML. So the views that we're going to be getting is going to be directly coming through the layout. And the layout, again, depends on which version of API you're running. And after we find them, we're pretty much done, right? And at the end, I do have a listener, and all this does is that it updates the text views with the text that I type. So let's go ahead and run it on both phones, just to make sure XML works. In terms of functionality, it should work the same. in both scenarios. If you don't need to use the support library, don't use it because it's just, I believe it's just a lot of more boilerplate code. Let's just add, well, I guess the hello world worked fine as well. Hello world, hello world, hello world. And the same thing up here. Notice that the third one does have different sizes. That's because I did that on purpose. If you remember, the third one was the preset sizes, and it doesn't have as much of a room because uh, I'm most likely thinking that it's 12 SP, but then it can't jump to 20 SP because it doesn't have enough room. So that's why they're different in sizes. But as you can see, this is API 27. So this is not using the support library. This is API 19. So it is using the support library, and they look the same in both one. And that's how you do it through XML. So let's go ahead and look into how not to do it through XML. It's a little bit of more code, obviously, because we're not going to be using any XML. The important thing we need to do is first start by not using support library through code. So the first thing we do is we initialize the widgets, which is basically just creating it inside our activity. So these are a bit of a code just to initialize stuff. The important thing is down here, when we initialize the widget, we pass it a variable, false and true, and just for me to find out which is a support library or not. And in an instance that it is a support library, we have to use app compat TextView, right? So in a way, it didn't actually change, because if I come back to the layout, you notice that this is also using app compat TextView. So instead of creating it in XML, we're just creating it inside our code. And if we're going to be doing it not through support library, then we'll just use a TextView, just like the way we did on our layouts down here, just TextView, right? So that's the difference between doing it through code or not. One is using app compat TextView, one is using TextView. And we're assigning it to our class members, which I've assigned here. So that works. And you may be wondering why this is not compiling. This is fine because app compat TextView is a different class than TextView, but app compat TextView does extend TextView. So it is basically a subclass of TextView, so this assignment is perfectly fine. And the rest is basically just setting the layout, making sure it looks pretty. There's padding around it. Not much to do with the project itself. In an instance that you are not going to be using the support library, you have to use these specific methods, and these actually correspond with the variables that we had in our XML. So let's go ahead and compare with this. So the first one was the default, right? Default is our first text view down here, default text view. You could either assign it this way, or you could assign it through, if you're going to be doing it through code, you need to use the set AutoSizing text type with default. And you're going to be passing the uniform. The other one you could pass is, I believe, none. So there's none, there's uniform, there's some other stuff too, I believe. I don't know if these are of view. Okay. Well, there's two for the AutoSizing, just the uniform, and if you don't want it to resize, there's none. I think it's better if you look at it this way. Yes, there's none and there's uniform. And the uniform is the one that we talked about, has a set of default values, minimum size, max size, and the steps for it. So that's what we're doing. This right here is the same thing as this guy right here. We're just setting it to uniform, right? For the second one is the second text view that we have here, right? The same way we're gonna set the maximum text size, we're gonna set the minimum text size, and the steps between each resizing. That's exactly what we're going to be doing here. Instead, we're just calling a method. Minimum size, maximum size, the steps, and it also needs a unit, right? So the unit that we passed here was SP, right? It's a bit more difficult to do it in this instance because these one's an integer. So as a fourth variable, you also need to pass it a unit. And to pass the unit, you need to use the typed value class. And in this case, I'm using SP, which is the recommended unit for text sizes. But there's different ones. You could use pixel, for example, if you want. So you have some more options down there. And the third method we're going to be using is the preset sizes, which again is like our third text view down here. So what we did here, if you remember, is we passed it an array. And we're going to be doing the same thing here. I declared the array size locally in my files, however, but it is the same one, 10, 12, 20, 40, and 100, which was the same as this array. And I will just pass it the array. It needs an array of integers. And again, it also does need a unit, right? So the same way we did the units with the last one, we also need to do the same with preset sizes. And this whole thing was doing it programmably with with not using the support library. So in our final case, we are going to be using the support library, but it's exactly the same, except we're going to be using a different library. So this is a static method that we're going to be using. So we're going to be calling this class TextVCompat, and then call this static method on it. The parameters are going to be exactly the same, except we're going to be passing the widget that we're going to be modifying. So in this case, instead of calling the method on as a member of the class itself, we're going to be passing the widget to the static method instead. But other variables, such as the uniform, will stay the same. And we'll look at the other two cases. In this case, with uniform configuration, we will pass the view into the function itself. Remember that we don't do the same while not using the support library. And the parameters, the minimum, maximum, steps, and the unit will stay the same. And it will be the exact same thing with the preset sizes. We will be passing the widget, so it is expecting a text view, and the array of integers and our unit of measurements, which in this case was SP. So now let's look at it when we are not initializing it to false. We are not using XML. And when we're not using an XML, either this code or this code would get called. And this depends on the build version, which in this case I'm using Android O, which is 27 or 26. Damn it. Yep, 26. And Jelly Beans was, I believe, 14 or 16. Yep. Um, yeah. So since this was 26 and above, right? So I'm asking, what is the build version of the phone? Build.version.stk integer, and that is an integer on the phone if it is bigger or equal to 26, which in this case it is because the symbol is running 27, so it is bigger than 26. And in our second version, Jellybean was 16, so if it is bigger than or equal to 16, which in this case it is, API 19 will run the support library. So this is not using support library. This is using support library. Now let's run it through code. program-wise, it should look the same in both instances, and it should look the same through XML. If it doesn't look the same, then you might have most likely um, initialized them incorrectly. If you also get an instance where the text views don't actually resize, it just means that you didn't call the support library correctly or one of the methods correctly. So yeah, let's just type a bunch of gibberish, I guess. And type that a lot. And that should look the same. Looks the same in both instances. And this was done through program. Alright, so we looked at all 4 different versions. It was a lot of code, but we did it. Congratulations. So let's go ahead and look at a overview of what we did. We had a main activity, right? This is the main place where we initialize our XML and views and create our support and non-support program steps. If we were going to use an XML, we did create 2 versions of it. And this was going to be declared on our set content view. As we discussed, there's 2 versions in this case. One is for one is for version 26 and above. And in this case, you just use TextViews. If you were not gonna use, so you need to use TextViews, and I think that's it. Yep, you just use the regular TextViews. If you're gonna be using support libraries, first import these 2 libraries, right? Make sure these are imported, and they're the latest version would be preferred. So not the exact version that I have. And then instead of text views, you have to use app compat text views. And instead of the Android name tag, make sure it's app, right? And if you get something like app is, missing or something, it just means the link up here is not declared. Your name tag is not declared. So initializing through XML was easy. We just find the views and we're good to go. Most of the code was in the XML. If we did not do it through XML, we start by initializing them manually. And if we are using a support library, it just means that you have to use app compat text view the same way we did with XML. If you're not, you just use the text view. And there's some other codes that I didn't go over. For example, replace widgets basically removes the views that I already have in the layout, but I just didn't find it useful to go over because it's just additional stuff. And the more important part is going through the individual methods. If you want to do default or the, I don't know how to pronounce this, granularity, let's just go with that, and then preset sizes, right? So it just depends on the type of project you're working on. You either want to do it through XML or you don't want to do it through XML. You either want to use the support library or you don't want to use the support library, or you probably just want one of the version of the text resizes. So this is like 20 or I don't even know, was it like 20 different ways of doing the AutoSizing text views. But just find whatever works for your project and just go ahead and use that. All right. Good luck on your projects.